The latest in two big PETA campaigns. Texas A&am's dog breeding has been stopped, but the animal tests have not. The other, well, it's not just a paperwork demand. It's an important step toward ending all animal tests funded by the National Institutes of Health. It's all action, not talk. What it means exactly, next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil, Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, major updates on important campaigns, the Texas A&am Dog Lab, and all the animal testing funded by NIH.
So every time we take one of these on, it is often a long battle. And we know that we're going to win because for one reason, we don't give up until we do. And for the other, we know that we're right. We know it's a waste of money. We know that most experiments on animals lead to nothing. More than 90% don't lead to therapies for humans. And we know we're going to win, but it isn't easy. And I have to give huge credit to our supporters because without them, it would be even more difficult. More than 500,000 people have emailed Texas A&am, and hundreds of people have called them. And this is what, in the end, makes such a huge difference to our campaigns.
Kathy Guillermo, PETA Senior Vice President, will provide the details. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. Please share a link with friends. Let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. And if you've just found us, welcome. And keep binging. I know some of you do. Hey, there's lots to listen to on the PETA Podcast. Your questions on veganism, get the context on all the dead horses in America's horse racing industry. You know, that number is now up to 31 at Santa Anita in California alone, as we talk. And 5 horses have died in the last few days of September in Belmont Park in New York. Also, hear all our frank conversations with PETA founder Ingrid Newkirk. It's all available 24/7 wherever you catch your podcasts. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, well, you know, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. 2 of PETA's major campaigns had breakthroughs recently. Texas A&am has stopped the breeding at the dog labs where the dogs were supplied as subjects for animal experiments in canine muscular dystrophy. If only it meant anything for human muscular dystrophy. After decades, it hadn't. The tests aren't over, though, and that's where you come in. And the second campaign that we're going to talk about is the move by Congress to seek a real plan to end the animal testing funded with your taxpayer dollars through the National Institutes of Health. PETA Senior VP Kathy Guillermo explains the significance in this conversation on the PETA Podcast. We have 2 updates today on PETA's work to end the use of animals in experiments. One involves Texas A&am University, which experiments on golden retrievers bred to have canine muscular dystrophy. First, Kathy, thank you for joining us. Remind us what these experiments are about.
We uncovered these about 2.5 years ago when somebody gave us video footage from inside Texas A&am's canine muscular dystrophy laboratory. And these are just awful experiments involving golden retrievers and other dogs who have been specifically bred to develop this awful muscular disease that is somewhat similar to human muscular dystrophy. And the idea that they had is that maybe they could experiment on these dogs and help humans, but that is not how it works. There is no cure for muscular dystrophy. There's been no treatment to come out of these experiments that actually help people with muscular dystrophy. And the dogs they're crippled and suffering, and their tongues swell and their muscles atrophy. and they're subjected to repeated muscle biopsies, repeated anesthetics, and then eventually they're killed.
Yeah, but Texas A&M put up a fight claiming there was justification. Was there no justification, either scientifically or medically, for these tests?
Well, we saw 40 years of dogs being bred for muscular dystrophy experiments. 40 years, hundreds of golden retrievers and other dogs. We have no cure, and we have no medication that reverses the symptoms. I think about 35 years ago, they should have figured this out. And I also think there's never any justification for using animals for experiments. We don't experiment on humans because we respect the rights of those humans. We should not experiment on animals, and we must respect their rights to live their own lives.
Now, Texas A&M wasn't above, say, using people with the disease as props, so to speak, to put them out there in the media to say, hey, look, this is our hope. This is our hope for a cure. Was it exploitation or was it false hope?
Well, it was false hope, and so they did surprisingly little of that. There was one mother of a young man with muscular dystrophy who was very vocal, and yet we had more than a dozen people with muscular dystrophy and others beyond that who didn't go public, but more than a dozen who said, this isn't right. I don't want these animals to be harmed in my name. And I would oppose this. I do oppose this. I want cures and treatments to come from modern, relevant, animal-free methods.
So now after 2.5 years, what's the big breakthrough? What did Texas A&M really do when they ended breeding of the dogs?
That's right. There were two things that happened recently. Number one is that Texas A&M got caught in a very serious lie. Now, remember, this is a major public university that takes hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars, federal taxpayer dollars, for their research programs. And they were outright lying about the fact that they bred these dogs. They implied, misled, outright stated that the dogs they experimented on just were born with muscular dystrophy, canine muscular dystrophy, not that they specifically bred these animals to have it. And we have been fighting that lie for 2.5 years, using their own breeding records as proof. And they were finally caught by the Dallas Morning News and had to admit that they had been lying about that for more than 2 years. That was the first thing. And the second very important breakthrough is that they have stopped breeding these dogs for experimentation. And this should be the beginning of the end of the program. We hope. We're not giving up the campaign, but it's a huge breakthrough that no more golden retriever puppies are coming into this world at Texas A&M just to be tormented and killed.
So the end of breeding means they have fewer subjects in which they could apply these tests to. So maybe the end of testing?
Well, it certainly signals that they are not putting a lot of resources into the testing. When we began our campaign, they had more than 100 dogs in the laboratory. And we now know that they have about 35 dogs, or perhaps even fewer than that. And, you know, it's a huge step forward, because even as they were claiming they did not breed dogs for experimentation, more than 100 puppies were born during that time. So to go from 100 puppies in 2 years to 0 is certainly a signal that they're taking the emphasis off this experimentation.
So they may not do any more tests, but how about the young scientists? And is there another generation of scientists saying, hey, we should continue the test of the doctor who pioneered this, there at Texas A&M, Joseph Cornegay. What are you seeing among his colleagues? Are there people who are backing off, saying, oh, this is bogus science? Or are there people saying, hey, we must prop up Cornegay's work? You know, he did it all these years. We got to continue it in another generation.
Well, in the way of people who torment animals for a living, there's not a lot of open dialogue around that question. But we do know that Cornegay, who is the one who pioneered the use of dogs for these experiments, He retired this year, and his retirement comes a year earlier than he had stated previously. So he's no longer doing these experiments. And there doesn't really appear to be much enthusiasm among any of his colleagues to take this up.
Did you force Cornegay out? Is that, can people come away with that thought that the pressure from PETA forced the end of this guy's career? And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't know that we forced the end of anybody's career, but I certainly think that we shone a spotlight on what was going on at Texas A&M and pointed out that millions of dollars had gone to fund this. And while people with muscular dystrophy who are desperate for treatments were waiting, a lot of time and money was being wasted. I don't know what Cornegay's personal reasons were for deciding to retire when he did.
And what about that Dallas Morning News article? What was the headline of that Dallas Morning News article? End of breeding, end of test in sight? What kind of article was it?
Well, the Dallas Morning News took a look at a number of issues involving the experimentation, and they gave quite a bit of space to Texas A&M University. I think the better articles that came out this morning, the Daily Mail has an excellent article about the end of the breeding. KBTX television did an excellent article, and they were not very pleased that they had been lied to by the university for more than 2 years, that they had been denied a tour of the laboratory for all that time. So I would encourage people to have a good look at those two articles.
Well, what did the Dallas Morning News say about being lied to? Did they make a big deal, or it looked like they buried the lead?
I think they could have made a bigger deal about the fact that a major university was lying to media in its own state, sure.
This is something that PETA comes up against. Look, I'm coming at you with as, hard questions as I would if you were, not with PETA. But did the Dallas Morning News try to soften it a little bit for Texas A&M, in your opinion? And is this typical of the kind of journalism that happens when PETA goes after institutions and, regional ones that have some sway where media publications do their thing?
I think that's a fair question. We deal with so many reporters because we generate so much news. And I find that most are so fair and reasonable and wanting to be objective about what they do. And this, of course, is wonderful because the public needs to know what's going on inside laboratories, and they need to be able to make up their own minds about what they think about it. We find sometimes that articles come out a little bit more skewed than we would like, one in favor of the other. It was really disappointing to us that the Dallas Morning News interviewed people and then didn't include those interviews. One was a physician who opposes these experiments, and there were more than 500 doctors who wrote letters to Texas A&M asking them to end this bogus experimentation. None of that was included. There was an activist on campus who's been harassed by the administration simply for objecting, using his free speech to object to these experiments, and that interview was not included. There's a young man who has muscular dystrophy who flew all the way from the United Kingdom to talk to the president of the university, who refused to talk to him, I might add, and who was harassed and detained by university officials, and he actually filed a lawsuit about this, and none of that was included. So that's always disappointing when the whole story doesn't come out there, but a lot of space is given to the people who are harming animals.
And essentially, the space was to maybe not justify what Texas A&M did, but to lessen the blow that, number one, they were lying and had lied to the media, and number two, that there was an end to the breeding, which should have been the headline.
It was the headline in most news articles because that was really the news. And I can't speak to the motives of some of the people who write these articles or the editors who edit them. But this is what I know. When people see the video of what happened to those dogs, and that's at PETA.org, they can have a look. When people see the video of what goes on to those dogs, they know there can be no justification for it. So in spite of what we may think are articles that don't tell the whole story, people need to look at the video and make up their own minds. Then they need to look at the physicians who've opposed it, the scientists who have weighed in on it, the reviews we've done of the published literature, all of the people with muscular dystrophy who are horrified to find out what's going on at Texas A&M. They really need to have a look at the entire picture.
And then once they go through all that information and they see that even with all that, all the new stuff that's happened, the published articles just recently, the end of breeding, the admission of Texas A&M lying, we still don't quite have the end of testing announced.
We do not have that, and that is why it's very important for us to close the deal here and put an end to these atrocities. You know, campaigns that challenge the well-funded structure at public universities are very difficult. We've had huge successes and many successes in shutting down university testing programs and specific experiments. It is not an easy thing to do. Many of them are government-funded programs. They have a multi-billion-dollar industry supporting them, all of the people who make the equipment that they use in these laboratories. They have a number of people a shrinking number of people, happily, who make their livings testing on animals, who are terrified that somehow they're not going to have access to this Grant gravy train anymore. So every time we take one of these on, it is often a long battle. And we know that we're going to win because, for one reason, we don't give up until we do. And for the other, we know that we're right. We know it's a waste of money. We know that most experiments on animals lead to nothing. More than 90% don't lead to therapies for humans. And we know we're going to win, but it isn't easy. And I have to give huge, huge credit to our supporters, because without them, it would be even more difficult. More than 500,000 people have emailed Texas A&M, and hundreds of people have called them. And this is what, in the end, makes such a huge difference to our campaigns.
And you point out something, too, that the pressure from the advocates to end these tests, while the tests go on, millions upon millions of dollars are being spent, federal dollars, taxpayer dollars, to keep these things going.
Well, that sounds like a segue into the other great news we have today. But yes, that's correct. So much money goes into this. It is its own mighty industry. And to bring down an industry is never an easy task.
Now, I must explain that I'm speaking to you from a remote studio, and you're at our home, and those bells that we hear, that's our cat, and we have our dog there. So just so people know that you don't have like a dog collar or a bell around your dog collar. That's not you.
That's right.
Okay. That's our dog.
I don't usually bark. That's correct.
Right. Okay. I just wanted to make sure people know. All right. So people can go to PETA.org. They can continue the pressure, because the tests at Texas A&M aren't over, and they should end. They must end. And with people's help, they can.
That's right.
You mentioned the segue, trying to force me into the other topic before I wanted to, but that's all right. That's all right. We can resolve these simple problems. But the other story involves the federal government and the National Institutes of Health, which is where if we follow the money, this is where a lot of money, taxpayer, federal funds, come into play when it comes to funding of animal experiments in the world, not just the United States, in the world. So what happened there with this big news in the NIH?
Well, a very important member of Congress, Representative Lucille Roybal-Allard, who is from California, has sent a letter to NIH Director Francis Collins, and she has demanded that he do two things. Number one, that he released to her a plan for the reduction in the use of the number of animals by NIH for experimentation. And this is really huge, because NIH has said for years that it wants to reduce, its goal is to reduce animal use. But number one, they don't. And number two, we have no way of knowing. So the second part of the representative's letter asked that NIH count every single animal they use, even the ones who, by definition under federal law, are not considered animals, and that they release that publicly so that we can monitor whether their program to reduce animal use is effective. We call this the count and reduce letter. And it's very crucial because Representative Roybal-Allard is on the committee that decides funding for NIH. So she has a great deal of authority and say in what happens at that agency.
You know, people might hear this and say, come on, are you kidding that she asked for a letter? She asked for a plan. This seems like a very simple bureaucratic thing. Why hasn't it been done to date? Isn't this the kind of thing that should have been done as a kind of pro forma routine thing to find out if, in fact, if Francis Collins and NIH says that there's going to be a reduction, shouldn't they have said, oh, and this is how we know we're going to have a reduction?
Oh, without question. Without question, the government should have been held accountable. The government agency should have been held accountable for what they have been doing. And they should have to explain a whole lot of things. Number one, they should have to explain why when 90% of experiments on animals fail to help humans, more than half their budget funds experiments on animals. They should explain why they continue to fund, just as one example, sepsis experiments on mice, when we've known since 2013 that sepsis is a different disease in mice than it is in humans. There are so many things NIH should be held accountable for. And that's why we're extremely grateful that this Congresswoman is holding them accountable, not only for what they do for animals, but for conducting good science. Because whatever you think about animal experiments, if you want cures for disease, then you better be doing good science to get there.
All right, but after all these years of activism and people have been fighting, vivisection for decades, why only now did someone come up with this idea? Oh, well, let's hold them accountable with this plan. Here's this letter. Let's have a count. I mean, they surely have a count.
It's been a battle for many years to try to get the Enforcement Agency for the Animal Welfare Act, which would be the U.S. Department of Agriculture, to require that animals in laboratories all be counted, which they don't do right now. It's been a battle for many years. And I think we have to remember that we are dealing with an entrenched culture of science. And it's one of the many failings of science in the modern world. And it's a shame. I think now we are beginning to chip away at that. We know that more than half the public opposes the use of animals in experiments for any reason. We've well documented the failure of animal experiments to help humans in significant ways. And I think right now what we have is all of those factors coming together. The research showing the failure of animal experiments is now out there. That's something we didn't have 25 years ago. We have it now. We have members of Congress who are willing to make that kind of commitment. It's things coming together at the right moment after many, many years of educating and exposés and pushing for the right thing to happen.
And now you have Congresswoman Lucille Roybal-Allard out of the Los Angeles area in California. And, she's not like one of those Congress people who are getting a lot of headlines like AOC or, all the other members of the squad. She is a woman who has been in Congress a long, long time. And this is how Congress works. You hang in there, you do your 2 years over a series of, umpteen years or umpteen, sessions. You get seniority, and now she's on this committee. Why Representative Lucille Roybal-Allard, and why now?
She is somebody who has a deep commitment to righting wrongs, I believe. She has gone about her work on many fronts to make sure that humans who have no representation are given a voice, and to make sure that animals are given a voice, and to make sure that science is done properly. And it isn't right now only that she has been working on issues like this. She was instrumental in our campaigns to end the maternal deprivation studies on baby monkeys that were conducted for more than 3 decades at the National Institutes of Health. And she was instrumental in ending the mutilation of goats by the Coast Guard in outdated trauma training drills. She has a long history of this, and she has worked away at it for many, many years.
And it doesn't hurt that she is a high-ranking member of this committee that holds the purse strings, right?
That's very important because she is very, very familiar with NIH and with the work they do. And she knows what she's dealing with here. And I think that's key. It will get NIH's attention, no doubt, but she has long advocated for the very best science to be conducted on the taxpayer dollar. And this is how we're going to make that happen to some degree.
You know, it's funny because all the attention has been given to the squad and AOC and, you know, all those, the freshmen coming in, the rabble-rousing progressives. But you get rid of some of the older folks who some of the squad replaced, and some of these older members, the way Congress works is you get seniority, you move up the ranks, you control everything, and that's the real power. So it's interesting to see how in this issue, one of the senior members of Congress, Representative Lucille Roybal-Allard, has come to the rescue of an issue that I don't think is really on the plate of the squad and some of the more famous members of late.
Well, I think it will be. You know, days are early still for many members of Congress, and there's a lot of educating and learning to be done. So we're hopeful. We're hopeful that they're going to follow this and get up to speed on this too.
And what does it mean for the animals if this happens? Will we see real massive reductions or even leading to the end of experiments on animals in NIH labs?
Experiments on animals have to end, and they will end eventually with the support of the American public because they simply don't work. And I think this is the beginning of that. We have a plan for ending animal experimentation, and we will certainly be making that available to Francis Collins to help him in this process. But I do think this is far-reaching, and I think this is significant. Because if nobody puts together a plan for how they're going to reduce animal use and improve science, then nothing's going to change. So I think this is an important first step in that whole process. It's not really a first step. I should correct myself there. I would say it's an important and significant step in this journey. And let me just add to this part of the discussion that we're also pleased to partner with another animal group in this process with the Congresswoman and with NIH. We're working with the New England Anti-Vivisection Society, NEVS, and I think this is an issue that most animal groups can get behind.
PETA Senior VP Kathy Guillermo, who's also my wife. Read more about the campaign she talked about at Texas A&amp and the move to get NIH to provide numbers and a plan that will hopefully begin the end of animal testing, at least those funded by NIH. You can read about it, take action at PETA.org. And that's our program. Hey, you can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's at aldef.org/blog, or at amok.com, amok.com. Yeah, me. once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. There's also a survey on our show notes. And, we have results of the survey. I know you're listening to us in bed, probably. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. Thanks for listening. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.